left off, let me go back to the previous slide real quick. We had just talked about this slide. Is this the last slide that we saw on Wednesday? This look familiar?
Yeah, I
Or
think
was
this is where we ended.
okay. So we talked about this slide already, or we had just opened it up?
Honestly, I can't remember.
We'll just go ahead and review this one. Okay, so the theory of evolution definitely faced some controversy and backlash, particularly in Darwin's time, due to the predominant religious doctrine of the time. So the theory of evolution via natural selection certainly requires that there's time for this evolutionary modification and change to occur. Especially when we're talking about humans, because humans already have a pretty long lifespan. Humans live 70, 80, 90, sometimes even more than 100 years. And evolution operates on populations, not necessarily on individuals. So, in order to observe even microevolution, we need to be able to observe multiple generations of that species, okay, or of that population, I should say. So sometimes you need to observe even hundreds of generations before you would see any significant evolutionary change, even microevolutionary changes. So that's why oftentimes when you learn about studies of evolution, microevolution, you're learning about bacteria or finches or fruit flies or pea plants, because obviously it's a lot easier to observe multiple generations if the organism itself has a relatively short lifespan in comparison to humans. So if you're looking at an organism that has a lifespan of a few weeks or a few months, that means you're able to study hundreds of generations in a decade, for example. Okay, so that's essentially why you're going to see evolutionary studies being done on populations other than humans. Okay, when we're looking at human evolution, generally we need to rely upon the fossil record because we can't always see evolution happening with the naked eye. Sometimes we can, but we can't always. We can definitely see at the molecular level. We can see that some humans in modern day are developing certain adaptations to environmental circumstances. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 5. Okay, so Darwin particularly faced backlash and controversy regarding the evolution of humans. Because, like we talked about a little bit last week, humans tend to have a little bit of a complex. Humans tend to think that we're somehow separate and or better or more evolved than the rest of the species on the planet, which in reality is just not true. We're subject to the same laws of nature as any other species is. Okay, we exceed carrying capacities and have consequences just like any other species would here on the planet. All right, so most of us have probably heard of Charles Darwin, but probably fewer of us have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was also a scientist doing his studies in the late 1800s. And he came up with a set of ideas, a hypothesis very similar to those of Darwin's. So both men independently talked about evolution via natural selection. So they were both presenting a very similar hypothesis, looking at the rate that organisms change and how they respond to the environment, how they respond to new pressures. So they were both talking about this concept of evolution via natural selection. Darwin was certainly concerned that Wallace would gain credit for the idea. Sorry, guys, I've got a little bit of a cough today, so please excuse me if I'm coughing a lot today. All right, Darwin was certainly concerned that Wallace would gain credit for the idea, so he certainly pushed to publish his ideas. So, some information about evolution. Evolution may occur gradually over time. So, we call that phyletic gradualism, or it may occur more rapidly with speciation events. We call that punctuated equilibrium. So, organisms respond to the environment. If the environment is changing gradually, if you're not seeing any huge cataclysmic events like asteroids hitting the Earth or major volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and hurricanes, tropical storms, if there's not major cataclysmic events, or just essentially it could be just be fluctuations in the food availability of a certain environment. But if you're not seeing those changes occur rapidly, then it's likely that the organisms are not being forced to change rapidly either. So when the environment is relatively stable, when you're not seeing these major climatic shifts, it's likely that the organisms will also remain relatively stable. So phyletic gradualism generally happens when the environment is relatively stable. Now we see extinction events and also then speciation events when there's more cataclysmic events, like an asteroid hitting the Earth, for example. That may cause extinction events, and then as organisms go extinct, that opens up these roles, the environmental niches for other organisms to fill. Okay, so we call that speciation and also adaptive radiation. So it's important to remember, like I mentioned this a little bit last lecture, one of the common misconceptions when in regards to evolution is this idea that humans share a common ancestor with chimpanzees and other primates. However, humans did not evolve from chimpanzees. Okay, that's really important. It's a really important distinction. And all of those images, like the image I showed you guys last week, if you open up any search engine, any Google search engine, and just type in the word evolution and then look under images, you're going to see that image of the chimpanzee here on the side and then the bipedal human all the way over here on this side. But you're seeing evolution displayed and represented in this linear fashion instead of in these branching events. Okay, so that's important to remember that that's actually a really bad representation of how evolution actually occurs. Evolution does not happen in a linear fashion. It's bushy, it's messy. A better way to think about it is a tree or a braided delta. So all of those branches on the trees, all of those streams lead off in completely different directions. All right, another common misconception is just the word theory. So prior to engaging in lecture one, you may have thought the word theory is just one scientist's idea or one scientist's hypothesis, which at least within the scientific community, it has a lot more clout than that. In order to get the title of scientific theory, it means that it's gone through rigorous hypothesis testing. It means that it's been tested by multiple researchers, multiple settings, and be proven to be supported in all of those circumstances. Now, it doesn't mean that a scientific theory it may eventually be disputed. That's certainly very true. However, a scientific hypothesis will only become a scientific theory after it has been tested repeatedly using the scientific method and proven to be supported by multiple researchers in multiple settings. So essentially what that means is that a scientific theory has a lot more clout than just one scientist's idea or hypothesis. All right, so evolution is essentially fluctuations or changes in gene frequencies from generation to generation. So that is actually something that we can mathematically measure. In chapter 2 and chapter 3, we're going to learn how to use Punnett squares to look at how we inherit genes from our parents. So essentially every single one of us, we inherit 23 chromosomes from mom's egg and 23 chromosomes from dad's sperm. And the combination of that makes up our genetic components. Okay, so we'll use Punnett squares to learn kind of the basics of genetics. I mean, when we're talking humans, a lot of traits are far more complex than the basic Punnett squares. But you know, the nice thing about Punnett squares is it does start to give you an idea of how genetic inheritance happens. Okay. And then in chapter 4, in topic 4, we'll start using the Hardy-Weinberg equation to essentially calculate the rate of genotypic frequencies from generation to generation. Okay, so it's important to remember that we cannot observe evolutionary change within one generation. It's something that needs to be studied over many generations. Okay, so some vocab words to get out of the way. Gene frequency is the number of genes in a population that exist for each form of a trait. So for example, we all have genes that code for our blood type. So if you inherit an allele for an A allele from both mom and dad, then you have type A blood. If you inherit an A allele from one parent and an O allele from the other, you actually still have type A because type A allele is dominant over O. And then if you inherit a type B allele from one parent and an O allele from the other, then you're type B because the A and the B allele are dominant over the other. So don't worry yet if it sounds confusing. We'll do some Punnett squares, probably not today, but probably next time. That'll help you understand this. Okay. So selective advantage. If a trait is beneficial to the individual in a given environment, it is likely to become more and more common within that breeding population. So if a trait is beneficial in one environment, it may not be beneficial in another. And I'll show you an example here in a moment. But think about for a moment the rock pocket mouse example. So the rock pocket mouse, we have the allele that codes for the brown colored fur, and then we've got an allele that codes for the black colored fur. Okay, so the allele that codes for the brown colored fur is beneficial if that mouse is trying to blend in with the sandy desert. So during that time frame, so prior to the substrate turning blackish in color, the allele that codes for the brown fur has a selective advantage. Okay, so those mice are going to be more likely to survive because they're more likely going to blend in with the sandy desert and avoid being eaten by hawks and eagles. Okay, that's just far more likely. And then the environment shifted. So I think I mentioned this in our last lecture. The environment shifted, and there was a volcanic eruption that covered the substrate, covered the sandy desert with this lava flow. Okay, so the lava flow, once it cooled, it became kind of blackish in color. So that meant all of a sudden the substrate was blackish in color. So then the selective advantage shifted to the mice that had the mutation for the black fur. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a little video clip on this just to demonstrate how this all happens. Okay, do we have any questions so far before I show you the video clip on the rock pocket mouse? Anything at all? Okay, so in your notes, as you're watching this, I'm going to give you just one question. So I want you to think about, how is the rock pocket mouse an advantage or an example of natural selection? So I'll say it again. How is the rock pocket mouse an example of natural selection? So just, jot that down in your notes and we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay. Oh, well, let me check on the volume just to make sure I've got that turned up for you guys. All righty.
Across the American Southwest, golden deserts dotted by cacti and brush stretch for miles. Yet here in New Mexico's Valley of Fire, the landscape changes dramatically. Patches of black rock interrupt the sand, remnants of volcanic eruptions that occurred about 1,000 years ago. The eruption spewed a river of lava more than 40 miles long across the desert. As the molten rock cooled, it darkened, leaving any creature dependent upon camouflage in serious trouble. In the complex battle of life, one of the constant struggles is between seeing and not being seen, the evolutionary game of hide and seek. And we've come here to the Valley of Fire in New Mexico, a battlefield, to find one of the tiniest soldiers and what it can teach us about how evolution works. On the desert sands, the rock pocket mouse blends in perfectly, its light-colored fur concealing it from predators. But on dark lava, the same fur makes the mouse stand out, attracting the many creatures that see it as food.
These mice are the Snickers bar of the desert. They're eaten by foxes and coyotes and rattlesnakes, and certainly by owls, and maybe even occasionally hawks. And most of those predators are visual predators.
So what happened to the pocket mice that found themselves on this new terrain? When I accompany biologist Michael Nachman onto the lava, it doesn't take long to find out.
Oh, this one's closed.
Nachman has been collecting mice unharmed in traps. And it's a dark one.
It is, yeah.
Now, are most of the ones you find up here dark?
Almost all of them.
Not only have the mice here evolved to be as dark as the rock,
Shake them into the bag.
the color change has occurred precisely where it will conceal them from hunters. And a bit of a white underbelly, too.
That's right. All of the dark ones here and on other lava flows have a white underbelly, and presumably there's no selection for dark on the belly because predators are coming from above.
Left to themselves, the mice show no preference for light or dark rocks. It's the predators that have made the difference.
The change in color over evolutionary time in the population is driven by predators weeding out the mice that don't match their background.
But how did the dark mice arise in the first place?
When a black mouse appears in a light population of mice, that is usually going to be due to a new mutation. And those are random and rare events.
To fully understand the pocket mouse transformation, Nachman moves from the lava to the lab. He and his team extract DNA from light and dark mice taken from one desert region. The aim? To find one or more genetic mutations that cause dark coloration. A mutation is a change in the chemical letters that make up our genes. It's a copying error that may occur when our cells divide. Mutation seems to mean that something bad has happened. Well, mutations are neither good or bad. Whether they are favored or whether they are rejected or whether they're just neutral depends upon the conditions an organism finds itself. So for the pocket mouse, a mutation that caused a mouse to turn black, that is good if you're living on black rock, and it's bad if you're living out in the sandy desert.
The light mice are all on the bottom, here.
Fur color is a trait controlled by many genes. To figure out how dark mice evolved, Nachman focuses on how these genes differ in dark and light mice. One by one, the genes prove identical, but at last, something does turn up. The difference between dark and light mice boils down to a difference of 4 chemical letters in a gene called MC1R. Because the gene controls the amount of dark pigment in a mouse's hair follicles, a mouse with these mutations grows dark fur, which gives it an advantage on a dark background. But still, that's one mouse. How would its dark fur spread to a whole population?
This lava flow is about 1,000 years old. And so you might wonder, has there been enough time? It's only been 1,000 years. It's a very short period of time for a new mutation to come along and spread, and so that all of the mice on this lava flow are black, because really they all are.
Indeed, such a rapid spread of a mutation may seem unlikely until you do the math. And the reason is that while only one new mouse born in 100,000 may be black, hundreds of thousands of mice are born in any given year. And then those mice that are black have enough advantage that their babies do better, and they have more offspring, and their offspring have more offspring. And just about a 5% advantage, compounded year in and year out, can very quickly turn the whole population black, as we see today. If dark color gives mice a 1% competitive advantage, and you start with 1% of the population being dark, then about 1,000 years, 95% of the mice will be dark. If instead, the dark color gives them a 10% advantage, then it only takes 100 years. Thanks to Nachman's mice, science has an example of evolution crystal clear in every detail.
What's exciting about this is that we have a system that's very simple ecologically. You have dark rocks and you have light rocks, and you have dark mice and light mice. It couldn't be simpler.
We know who the predators are, what the selective force is. We know precisely the genetic basis of what makes the mice have an advantage or a disadvantage depending upon where they live. All the pieces are finally together. It's a perfect illustration of Darwin's process of natural selection. In fact, it's more than that, for Nachman's mice also counter a common misconception that evolution is a random process. Well, there is one random component, and that's the process of mutation. Mutations occur at random throughout our DNA. Every new organism is born with a new set of mutations. But while mutation is random, natural selection is not. Natural selection sorts out the winners and losers, and that's really what the whole process of evolution is driven by. But if natural selection is not random, Would it produce the same result under the same conditions? It does. And here's proof. Rock pocket mice collected by Nachman from other lava flows in other parts of the Southwest. These are two different black mice, and they each evolved on different lava flows. And the lava flows are hundreds of miles apart, but the changes, the genetic changes that made these mice black, were different in each case. And what's amazing to me is how similar the black mice are. We didn't know when we started this whether we would find that there were the same genes or different genes, and we were really surprised to find that they were completely different genes, and yet if you look at the mice, they look almost identical. Clearly, there are different genetic ways to make a mouse dark. But once the beneficial mutations appear, natural selection, the non-random part of evolution, can, under very similar conditions, favor very similar adaptations. In effect, each of these lava flows is like rewinding the tape of life and allowing evolution to occur again and again. And in each case, we find the dark mice have evolved. The rock pocket mice show us that evolution can and does repeat itself, and why evolutionary change is never ending. As environments transform, so must the species that inhabit them, adapting and readapting in the great and complex battle of life.
All right, so who would like to give me an example or explain how the rock pocket mouse demonstrates natural selection and or demonstrates this concept of a selective advantage? You can verbally say it or type it in the chat. Any
Would it be how
ideas?
would it be how like they evolutionized into different like types of fur color depending on the rocks that they lived on?
Sure, yeah. So the MC1R mutation that caused the black colored fur, that MC1R mutation was always there, but it only became an advantage. There's only a selective advantage once there was a volcanic eruption. Okay, so once the substrate turned blackish in color, that's when that MC1R mutation all of a sudden had the advantage. Okay, so that term mutation doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. A mutation is just any random change in the genetic material. So that mutation, the MC1R mutation, is what coded for the darker fur color. Okay. So, like they said in the film, if a dark color gives a 1% advantage, and it would take about 1,000 years, even though mice have a relatively short lifespan. So I like that little film clip because it helps demonstrate, you know, the amount of time evolutionary change, even micro evolutionary change, it can take a long time. So if that dark color gives a 1% advantage, it would take 1,000 years for 95% of the mice to be the black color. However, if the dark color gave them a 10% advantage, then it would only take about 100 years for the mice in that population to be mainly the black color. Okay. So it really depends upon the degree of selective advantage, right? It depends upon how beneficial that mutation or that change in the DNA, what kind of benefit does it provide for the organism? Okay. So I like that little example because even that's a simple example. You know, it's mice that are two different colors. And it helps demonstrate how this might occur, how evolutionary changes might start to occur. Do you guys have questions for me so far? We're feeling okay? Okay. So in this chapter, we begin to introduce the idea of what we call forces of evolution. Okay, so forces of evolution are essentially anything that would disrupt the staticness or the way that organisms stay the same sometimes. So if organisms are changing, if they're responding to evolutionary changes, that means that these forces are operating, or at least one of these forces is operating. So you can think of the forces as essentially anything that inspires or invokes evolutionary change within a breeding population. Okay, so number one is mutation. So they talked a little bit about mutation in the film there. So mutation is the only random source of new genetic material or a random change in the DNA. So mutations are not always bad. Sometimes they provide a benefit, sometimes they're neutral, meaning that they don't provide a benefit or a detriment to the organism. So that mutation is just any random change in the DNA, okay? Number two is gene flow. So that's the result of the migration or admixture of genes between two populations. So the easiest way to think of it is population A interbreeding with population B. So gene flow, when we're talking evolution, is always a good thing. In the game of evolution, diversity will always win. You're probably going to get sick of hearing me say that this semester, but it's an important concept to bring home, that evolutionary diversity is, or genetic diversity is, a positive thing for all species. Number three is genetic drift. There will be two types that we talk about, not in this chapter, but in a future chapter. But for now, know that genetic drift is any random change in gene frequencies. The two types that we will talk about are the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. But don't worry about that yet. Just know for now, genetic drift is any random change in gene frequency. And then, of course, number four is going to be natural selection. So that's what we've been talking about already. So individuals with favorable traits will survive and reproduce at higher rates. Okay, so in this case, after the volcanic eruption, the mice that had the MC1R mutation, the mice that had the black colored fur, had the selective advantage. So therefore, they were more likely to be able to blend in with their environment and avoid being consumed by predators. And if they're more likely to survive, then they're also more likely to reproduce. Okay? So these are the four forces of evolution. So what those forces are what inspires evolutionary change or genotypic frequency change within a breeding population. All right, so the next part of this lecture is going to delve into the 5 scientific disciplines that influenced Darwin when he developed his theory of evolution via natural selection. Okay, so this slide here just introduces the 5 disciplines, and we're going to talk about it in more detail on the slides coming up. Okay, so all you need to do right now is just write down the 1 through 5, and then we'll talk about 1 through 5. So the first one, the second one we're going to talk about is paleontology, or the study of fossils. And the third one we're going to talk about is taxonomy and systematics. The fourth one we will talk about is demography. And the last one we will talk about is evolutionary biology. Okay, so we're just writing down these 5 things right now, and then we're going to talk about it in detail. So the first one is geology. The second one is paleontology. The third one is taxonomy and systematics. The fourth one is demography. And the last one we'll talk about today is evolutionary biology. All right, so let's first about geology. So the 2 scientists, the 2 geologists that influenced Darwin when developing his theory of evolution via natural selection will be Hutton and Lyell. So James Hutton was among the first to study natural forces such as wind and rain. And he originally calculated the Earth's age to be in the millions of years. Okay, we now know through geological and paleontological evidence that the planet is actually 4.6 billion years old. But for the time, this, the proposition or the hypothesis that the Earth was millions of years old was controversial for the time. Because remember, many religious texts suggested that the planet was only, 4 to 10,000 years old. So Hutton is also famous for developing his theory or hypothesis called uniformitarianism. So this is the idea that the natural processes operating today, such as wind, water erosion, flooding, volcanoes, and earthquakes, are the same as the natural processes that happened in the past. Okay? So, and we understand, geologists understand how these natural processes affect the Earth. So how, for example, how water erosion formed the Grand Canyon, for example. Geologists understand how these natural processes impact our planet. So through uniformitarianism, these early geologists were able to hypothesize about the actual age of the Earth. Okay, so that's uniformitarianism right there. All right, so Charles Lyell was a student of Hutton's. So Charles Lyell utilized Hutton's theory of uniformitarianism, and he proposed that the various aspects of the Earth's surface are variable through time, but the underlying processes that influence them are relatively constant. He also proposed that the Earth must be significantly older than previously proposed. So not millions of years old, but billions of years old. So we now know from geological and paleontological evidence that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. And we know that, you don't have to take it, you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at any scientific textbook. And it's basically using radiocarbon dating, uranium dating, essentially using chemistry and half-lives to determine how old rocks are, essentially. Okay, and we can also, because essentially fossils are rocks, fossils are organic material that has been completely fossilized or completely turned into rock. So also we can use radiometric dating, uranium dating, these various dating techniques to determine how old the fossils are as well. And we'll learn, of course, a lot more about that when we get to Unit 3. Okay. So Charles Lyell utilized Hutton's theory of uniformitarianism. He proposed that the various aspects of Earth's surface are variable through time, but the underlying processes that influence them are relatively constant. He also proposed that the Earth must be significantly older than previously proposed, and we now know that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. All right, the next field that influenced Darwin when developing his theory of evolution via natural selection is called paleontology. So paleontology, we've already talked a little bit about what human paleontology is. Human paleontology is the study of human fossils or human remains, but paleontology is just the study of fossils in general. Okay, so Robert Hooke was one of the very first paleontologists, and he tested the idea that fossils were actually the remains of ancient life by studying the microscopic structure of wood. And he found that fossil wood had a structure identical to that of living trees. So through this, Hooke concluded that fossil wood came from once living trees. Okay, so this seems like a relatively simple concept to us now, because obviously we now know that fossils exist and we know that organisms have changed over time, that organisms are related to one another and share a common ancestry. We know all of this, or we have evidence of all this, I should say. But at the time, this is revolutionary, this idea that we could actually study organisms that lived millions of years ago, possibly even billions of years ago, through this field of paleontology. All right, Georges Cuvier was a French naturalist, and he was also an anatomist as well. So he applied anatomy, his knowledge of anatomy and structural makeup to a study of comparative anatomy in fossils. So his studies demonstrated that fossils found in geographic strata were actually the remains of animals that had gone extinct. And he hypothesized that certain species may have gone extinct due to environmental catastrophes. Okay, so through this, he came up with the doctrine or the hypothesis called catastrophism. So catastrophism is the doctrine asserting that cataclysmic events such as volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods, rather than evolutionary processes, are responsible for geologic changes throughout Earth's history. Okay, so a great example of this is the asteroid that hit the Earth that killed most of the dinosaurs. Okay, but it's important to remember that this didn't happen overnight. It possibly took years for this to happen because the asteroid hit the Earth, it stirred up all the sediment, all that sediment blocked out the sunlight. Once the sunlight was blocked out, photosynthesis could no longer occur because remember, plants, they need sunlight for photosynthesis to finish its life cycle. Plants need sunlight and oxygen and water. And then plants need sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and then they release oxygen for us. Okay, so the plants died out. Then once the plants died out, then all the herbivores, the organisms that eat the plants, died out. And then eventually all the carnivores died out, all the organisms that ate the herbivores. So even though this is a cataclysmic event, it didn't mean that the dinosaurs were all extinct the next day. Okay, now likely, of course, the dinosaurs that were very near the asteroid, yes, of course, they were likely extinct immediately. But those that live farther away from where that asteroid hit, it likely took years, possibly even decades, to become completely extinct. All right, so the next discipline that influenced Darwin is taxonomy. So before Darwin, most scientists recognized and realized the need for classification. or essentially the need to organize or classify life forms into nice, neat little bins and boxes. We as humans really like to do that. We like to categorize and simplify our world by putting them into neat little categories. So early taxonomy was based on the idea that species did not change. Even Linnaeus himself hypothesized that species were relatively constant. So Linnaeus created a hierarchical scheme of nomenclature that provided unique names for all varieties of plants and animals. So, and this is actually the taxonomic scheme, the way of classifying living organisms that we still use today. We still use we still use Linnaeus's taxonomic scheme. Okay, so every living organism on this planet has a genus and a species name. For humans, our genus name is Homo and our species name is Sapiens. So that combination, our genus and species name is Homo sapiens. All right, so Linnaeus developed a system of binomial nomenclature still used today. So we break that word up. Bi means two, nomenclature means naming. So every species has a genus and a species name or two names. So each plant and animal has its own unique genus and species name. A great example is us, Homo sapiens. We know that Linnaeus's book on taxonomy went through about 10 revisions, and with each revision, he added more levels, more complexity to his system. So you're noticing a trend here at the time, including humans in this taxonomic scheme was considered controversial because humans were considered to be made in God's image and therefore separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. So you guys are noticing a trend here that a lot of these scientists were met with a lot of controversy and a lot of backlash from the religious doctrine of the time. So even Linnaeus, even just simple classification, faced a lot of backlash. All right, so this slide here is going to show you kind of how the scheme works. Now, don't worry, you don't necessarily have to memorize this whole thing, but I do want you to understand the complexity here. I want you to understand how complex Linnaeus' system really is. Okay, so kingdom, there's only two kingdoms. There's kingdom Animalia and kingdom Plantae. And then once you get down here to class, so we're class Mammalia. So we share a class with every other mammal. We share a class with a cow, with a dog, with a dolphin, with a horse, with a lemur, with a chimpanzee. You get the picture. Anything that's a mammal, we share a class with, okay? And then once you get down to order, we share an order with all other primates. So with lemurs, with mandrills, with vervet monkeys, with capuchin monkeys, with chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, anything that's a primate, we share an order with, okay? We share a suborder with all of the higher order primates. So that's going to include all the New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, apes, and us. Okay, and then we share a superfamily with all the apes. We share a genus with the other hominins that start with Homo. So Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo naledi. You guys get the picture. Okay, so as you move your way down the taxonomic scheme, you're getting organisms that are more closely and closely related. Okay, until you get to genus and species. Homo sapiens, those are the organisms, when they're the same genus, same species, that means that they're capable of interbreeding with one another and producing viable, fertile offspring. Okay, now second to last discipline that influenced Darwin when developing his theory of evolution via natural selection is demography. So another way of thinking of demography is just population genetics and population biology. So Thomas Malthus was actually an economist mainly. He was the founder of demography, and he looked at how he wanted to understand why poverty exists. He wanted to understand poverty as it existed in England. Okay, so he looked at population size being potentially limited by food supply, which sounds relatively simple, right? Here in modern day, we think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That of course, population size is going to be limited by the amount of resources available, the amount of food available, the amount of territory available, the amount of mates that are available. That all makes sense, right? But at the time, that was somewhat revolutionary. That was a somewhat new idea. So population size being limited by resources. So when we look at this graph here, so the kind of steady line is representing the resources here, okay? And then right here, this is the point of crisis or the carrying capacity. You may also hear it called carrying capacity. So once the population size, this line here, once the population size grows exponentially and exceeds the point of crisis or exceeds the carrying capacity, that's when organisms start to die out, or that's when you see higher levels of competition for access to food, access to territory, access to mates. That's when competition really starts to happen, okay? And when a population has exceeded the carrying capacity for that environment, that's also when you start to see organisms starving to death, when you start to see organisms not having enough food for survival, right? So that's what we call the point of crisis, or when a population has exceeded the carrying capacity. So this is important to Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection because it really applies to survival of the fittest, right? Now, survival of the fittest doesn't mean, remember, it doesn't mean the strongest or the most aggressive or the best looking. That's really not what we mean by survival of the fittest. It just means which organisms are the best or the most successful at surviving in a given environment, okay? So for the rock pocket mouse, just to keep it simple, for the rock pocket mouse, we're simply talking about those mice that had that MC1R mutation. If we're talking about the environment post-volcanic eruption, right? So once the substrate turned blackish in color, the organisms, the mice that had that MC1R mutation that coded for the blackish fur, they had the advantage. Okay, that was survival of the fittest in that case. Okay, so that's essentially why Darwin was interested in the ideas and the theories of an economist, essentially, because he really came up with this idea of population size being limited by food supply to explain poverty. All right, the last kind of discipline that will influence Darwin when he developed his theory was called biology, okay, or evolutionary biology. So by the late 1700s, scientists began to argue for change in biological organisms. They started to recognize that, yes, organisms do change over time. They're not necessarily going to remain static forever. So Lamarck speculated that animals change for purposes of self-improvement, and he actually coined the term biology. Okay, so Lamarck's theory is called inheritance of acquired characteristics. And I'm sure you've probably, if you've ever taken a science class or a bio class, you've probably seen this very famous picture associated with Lamarck. So you've got the giraffe that's gradually getting a longer and a longer neck because that allows that giraffe to exploit additional resources, right? So that giraffe is no longer limited by only the leaves that are, low hanging. That giraffe can now get leaves that are higher and higher and higher up in the canopy. Okay, so it's this idea that animals will change anatomically in response to new demands or needs, and then they will pass those changes along to their offspring. Okay, so Lamarck was generally correct. What he got wrong was the time frame, because in evolutionary terms, it takes many, many generations for this to happen. Okay, so it really emphasized the importance of interactions between organisms and their environment. So he got a lot correct. He really did. It's what he really got wrong. What he really wasn't completely correct on was the time frame, because as we're learning, or as we learned, through the last 200 years of studying evolution, is that this stuff takes time, especially when we're talking about organisms that have a relatively long lifespan. So a good way to think of this too, if I dye my hair purple, I'm not necessarily I'm not going to pass that gene along to my kids. Or if I, spend a bunch of time in the sun and I get really, dark melanin, if I, over time, if my skin gets really tanned and kind of damaged, it doesn't mean that I'm going to pass that along to my children. My children are still going to get the genes that code for a relatively lighter skin tone, since I have a lighter skin tone. Now, in comparison to that, if I were to move to a region that had really high UV exposure, and me and my ancestors stayed there for many, many, many generations, hundreds, possibly thousands of generations, and yes, it is possible that over time, our skin tone, we would have the genes that code for darker and darker melanin production over time. Okay, but nothing like this will happen in 1 generation, 2 generations, or even 10 generations. It's going to take a lot longer than that. Okay. All right, questions so far? Questions for me? Yes.
I'm just a little curious, with the mice, going back a little bit, and with the giraffes.
Uh-huh.
Now, they're stretching their necks or they're reaching up, but there seems like there's some type of intervention for their or with the mice for because that was soot. What something changed in their DNA for that their hair to turn black.
Yes, that was the MC1R mutation. So remember when they talked about the mutation?
No, no, I
So the
remember.
mutate.
Go ahead.
So remember the mutation, that's the random part. The mutation is just any random change in the DNA. Okay, so as far as we know right now, mutations are completely random. Every single generation, there will be thousands of mutations. Some
Okay,
of
so
those mutations are random. Well, they're all random. Some of them will provide a benefit. Some will be neutral, meaning we won't even know that they're there. Okay, so there's.
wait, can we talk about the circumstance? Because there was lava flow and the light colored mice are getting attacked from above because they can be seen on the black rock. So they're going
Right.
away, right? And the black ones are surviving because they can't be seen. They're not being hunted as much. But
Correct.
so did the stress of being eaten cause a genetic mutation?
No. So that's the misconception of evolution. So the mutation is just completely random, but the environment will select for the traits that are beneficial. So that's why it takes so many generations to observe it. So let's say we're talking about the mice, and let's say that so the MC1R mutation was always there, even when it was the brown colored mice that had the advantage. The mutation was always there. It was just that before the lava flow happened, that mutation wasn't selected for because the black colored mice, they were more likely to get eaten in that circumstance. So that meant that they weren't going to pass along their genes to anybody else, right? So if those black mice got eaten before they reproduced, I'm not saying it happened every time. Like, yeah, even in the time before the lava flow, there were still some probably black mice that got through and, passed along their genes to future generations. But on average, it's going to be far more likely that the brown colored mice survive prior to the lava flow, right? When the substrate is still brown.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's just the environment is selecting for what characteristics end up surviving. Okay. So it's really the environment that determines it. And then the genetic stuff, that's completely random. At least as far as we know. Now, there is an up and coming field called epigenetics that's looking at how the environment may influence the rate of mutation. Okay. So that's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I promise what I teach you now is stuff that we know for sure. Okay. So it's certainly possible that that mutation rates are influenced by the environment, but we don't have any evidence of that for certain yet. Okay. So what we know thus far is that mutations are completely random.
Okay,
And that it's essentially selective pressures that, it's the environment that determines what mutations get selected for. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, yes, it does.
Okay, perfect. Good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. Other questions? We're good? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to stop the recording. And let's do some work.